All right, so our Istio working group meeting for May 28th. Top agenda item is about driving ambient to default. This is the request for consideration from Craig Box. I see actually I'm called out as one of the people who may be able to talk to this, which surprises me a little bit. So I'm going to phone a friend. Stephen, Keith, do you know why we're called out here?
Yeah, Craig started a group message about this. I think, yeah, if you open it up, I can talk through this briefly.
Sure.
I'm going to go ahead and open the doc that Craig linked.
Yeah, I'm going to. I just can't remember where I hid my tab. It's in here somewhere. There it is.
All right. So the basic thrust of this doc is similar to some of our efforts in the past to drive ambient to beta and then drive ambient to GA. This doc sort of talks through what it would take and the steps we need to take in order to drive ambient to be the default experience for Istio users. And on top of that, we'd also make Gateway API the default configuration mode for sidecars. Got go through some background, talking about how much time has passed. Don't think I need to go through all of that. If you could scroll down to the definition set, perfect. So basically, when we talk about defaults, we were talking about a couple of things. One, when a user does istio install or helm install, like by default, what gets put inside the cluster. Install doesn't necessarily mean enabled. It's just that it's possible to be enabled without further installation. And by installation, there's a bit of a circular definition there. My understanding is that this means like changing environment variables or things like that. And we also want to show users that this option, meaning ambient gateway API, is the happy path in documentation. So if we're going to choose like a default experience for best user experience, like ambient and gateway API would be those things. And so now we start talking about, well, first I'll pause. I'm standing in for Craig here. He could explain it a bit better than I can probably, but does this generally make sense as far as what's being proposed here?
I think so.
Okay.
The install enable dichotomy is a little strange. Like for instance, presumably ztunnel must be running at the end of istio install if ambient is installed by default.
Yep, exactly. That would be one of the big changes. Same with like Istio CNI, for example. That would be the default installation set. So like there's some. Again, I'm still coming up to speed on the proposal as well, but I think there are some dominoes that sort of fall out from this. For example, if ambient's the default, that probably means that Istio CNI should be the default IP tables programmer for sidecars as well. Yeah, I think that's some clarification that if you've got questions about, we should put it in the document. Let Craig answer.
I'll open a question here because I don't know what it means to install the ztunnel and not have it enabled. What is the enablement thing?
I think. Go ahead, Lior. I think it's Lior.
I was saying I would probably guess that it means that no workloads in the mesh yet, like no traffic is getting redirected there.
So basically, the existing label that we use to control ztunnel enrollment would continue to be off by default.
Then just a guess.
Yeah. I think my reading of this is the necessarily is doing a lot of heavy lifting, so he's trying not to say that ambient is automatically set up for your workloads. But good to have clarification at least.
Anyways, I don't mean to hold things up. You can keep going, Keith.
So today, we've tried to, and that is, I'm going a bit off script here, but I think looking at our history with ambient so far, we have tried to be very flexible when it comes to allowing users to continue to use sidecars using, you know, a subset of different APIs. Some APIs like progress, some don't, etc. We've been trying to live in this world where we try to move both forward without making strong statements, or specifically without trying to deprecate or remove anything, which I still think is a firm goal. But without making very strong directional moves as a project. And so this leads to statements like you can use existing Istio traffic APIs alongside gateway API. So you can use an HTTP routes and a virtual service in the same cluster. We also said like Istio is going to continue to support sidecars and integrate them seamlessly with ambient mode. And as things have evolved, at least Craig's position is that the API might be different here. Maybe seamless is not going to be the goal, but migration is a goal. The way this was surfaced, I think one of the primary motivators, I'll say, for how this surfaced was documentation. So when you look at our documentation, we currently do a couple of different things. So for one, we treat ambient mode as sort of a reset, where things that were off by default in sidecar mode, like DNS redirection, is now on by default. That is, to some extent, due to implementation details and implementation differences, but that is a difference in documentation. One of the biggest points of friction in ambient and sidecar is that we have two different gateway objects in Istio. One is the gateway API resource, and the other is the Istio gateway resource. And they do fairly different things. One today will by default like create new infrastructure. The other just program existing infrastructure. So like that is one user experience thing with documentation that is fairly difficult to try to reconcile on documentation, trying to present both at the same level of prominence. Pause there on the interoperability part. Any questions or comments to throw in there?
I guess I feel like, well, based on our previous question that Mitch added in the doc, this seems hard to define or support until we have an interop story between sidecar and ambient, especially if everything that you need for both is going to be on your installed when you run istio-ctl install. I don't know, it just seems like it just leads to even more ambiguity between the two different modes. So if we don't have interop between, or at least a defined interop story or documented one, it could just lead to even more user confusion.
I think that's true. I sense, and again, I'd have to defer to Craig, but I sense that this RFC is specifically in the context, or I interpret it to be in the context of net new users. Today, when you look at the documentation, net new users are faced pretty instantly with choices they have to make. Someone on my team was looking at overhauling some of this documentation, and it's like, okay, so you need to have like at least 3 different tabs. You have like the default one, looks like the Istio APIs for programming a gateway. And you've got the Istio sidecar gateway API tab. You've got the ambient tab. From the day one, you're lit with choices. And as a new user, you probably don't know the merits or value of any of those. You're going probably based on what's there first. And what I think is being proposed here is that like the default experience for fresh Istio installs would be ambient mode. And if you do deploy a sidecar, that gateway API be sort of the default experience that we are telling users to use. We've sort of set this in guidance and some like warning things in the docs. But I think this is proposing taking that a step further and changing the docs to show gateway API first, changing the docs to show ambient first. which there is a couple of reasons why that's more difficult, but that's below.
I think I am agreeing, or at least on the same, at least understand, I guess, under the assumption that only new users are reliant on Istio CTL install for installations. I guess that's making the assumption that no old, existing users are relying on that for spinning up new installations or whatnot. That's not part of their workflow, which I guess to me, at least it seems like it would be part of some, even though maybe it's not, ideal, I guess. Yeah, I guess I'm just concerned of the impact this would have on existing users, even if this is intended for, new Istio users.
There's probably a substantial impact just from folks like using that in CI to spin up new clusters and such.
Right. So that's kind of my concern is if that install looks different, and then now you have, yes, depending on what the answer is to the question Mitch added, but now I have a Z tunnel and now I have different defaults and I didn't know about that. I'm just using the same command I've always been using. That seems quite scary.
We do have compatibility modes, right? And those work in both Helm and Istio Cuddle?
Yes, but to Jackie's point, the concern is that if we change the default behavior, that's a break and change. And so any break and change like this, we're relying on users to be reading the documentation, to be looking at GitHub, and seeing we're changing the behavior. And as opposed to if they don't read those things, they're just going to see new stuff pop up in the cluster, maybe new defaults on like new DNS redirection turned on by default. Like if we want to do something like this, it would need to be executed. There needs to be a lot of effort to just evaluate whether or not this is possible to do safely.
Well, and I want to make sure that we're not calling all default changes breaking. So for instance, if we rolled out a change today that was always install the ztunnel unless explicitly told not to, that's not a breaking change. It's not going to harm anyone who's using sidecars today or anyone who's using ambient today. Both of those use cases continue to work seamlessly. There's a new component for some folks and they might not understand why it's there. That might raise some concerns, but it doesn't break functionality. Enabling DNS interception by default might require a little bit more because ztunnel doesn't do anything unless you configure it to do something, right?
But sidecars also have
absolutely
DNS redirection. Sidecars also have DNS redirection. I think it's the same flag.
Right. So that would be maybe a little bit more concerning and require digging in deeper. I just don't want to paint with a broad stroke and say that all changes of defaults are breaking changes.
That's totally fair. Yeah, I guess good to distinguish between something that exists that didn't exist before, but yet doesn't break anything for existing users versus what, something that now will be set that could have potential impact and break. Okay, that's a good call.
Yes, I know you've got other topics on the agenda, so I'm going to try to cut this a bit short. The last thing I'll say on this doc is that my major concern with this direction is I think directionally it would be great for new users to be in ambient mode. Like I think that makes sense and is better for users. I have a lot of questions about how we get there explicitly or specifically on the parity point. There are still things that that are in Istio APIs that can't be done in the Gateway API. There's still some even like within the Istio APIs, there's still some weirdness. For example, service entries behave wildcard service entries. You can't do those in ambient today like you can in sidecar. That's a trivial example, but we can't move users backwards and like remove features. Like that would be to some extent a breaking change. And so if we were to change the default experience and remove features, I think that does well. Okay, let me be more specific. Well, it's not breaking in the sense of breaking users in production. It is a impedance mismatch in the expectations of users. And I don't think we should move them backwards. So to move in this direction, we'd have to, as a project, invest a good bit of engineering resources towards parity maybe even in those cases where it's not as necessary for users. So, and by what I mean by that is even those cases where we don't feel like users in ambient mode need a feature, like the sidecar CRD is a great example of that. Do we still need parity for those things? There's a lot of open questions there. Ian, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm a little concerned, like a new user to mesh would not really probably have an expectation about how wildcard service entries should behave. So I definitely think, if you're coming from sidecar, you may be familiar with that, but it's sort of a different concern than brand new users.
To some extent, yes. I pick wildcard service entries to it on purpose because I think it draws this out. You've got a thing where, as a project, we're saying this thing is better than this old thing, but there are whole scenarios, at least as it stands today, there are whole scenarios that you cannot achieve, like valuable scenarios that you cannot achieve in ambient mode that you can in sidecar mode. I don't know that we can make. I wouldn't feel comfortable making ambient the default with that being the case.
Yeah, I think it would be more helpful to like get that list of what are these use cases. Like I think probably what you're thinking of is just like a generic egress, right? That would be a good use case that we should tackle. It doesn't necessarily have to be wildcard host names in service entry, but get that list of like what do we consider the bread and butter of Istio that you can't represent well in ambient today, and we can start burning that down.
Yeah, I'm in agreement on the how. I don't mean to imply that we need to start with the implementation details of sidecar and copy those over to ambient. I do think that we can't leave use cases like that, like valid, valuable use cases on the table. Like for example, I think the sidecar resource doesn't have a valid use case in ambient mode, and I wouldn't think that we want to carry that over. But like the generic egress use case does. So hopefully that clarifies a bit.
Yeah, for sure. And getting those, I think, in some doc, any doc, hopefully this doc, would be super helpful to just know, how far do we have to go before we're ready for something like this.
And for what it's worth, as Mitch is typing here, I share some of the concerns with some of the goals around interoperability as currently stated in the document. I do think that parity and migration and interop is an explicit goal, and we've heard from many users asking for that. So we need to certainly, I would certainly be very hesitant to drop anything in that direction. Any last questions or comments on this topic before we move on? As I saw, we have a pretty full agenda today, so want to try to make sure I don't monopolize the entire time. All right, action item for everybody. Go ahead and read that doc and leave comments. Thank you.
All right. Next up, it looks like we have a request from Jway regarding mesh config precedents. Jway, are you with us? Jway, you came off mute for just a second, but it didn't sound like you said anything yet.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, cool. My browser is a little bit slow. Yeah. Hi. Yes, this issue I opened a while ago. It's more about user experience of mesh config. I have I listed two questions here. They are highly related. The first one is the precedence of mesh config. I listed I think 4 here. So I think the highest priority is workload annotation, then the standard mesh config, shared mesh config, then the default config we specified in the code. Yeah, and about the order, yeah, first I try to understand like why standard mesh config has a higher priority than shared mesh config. Yeah, this is my first question. And the second question is kind of related about the merge behavior. Yeah, there's some discussion below. But so currently, I looked at the Istio code base. So it looks like we are doing the complete override. As an example here, this trace, this is an example from the doc. So trace, we have some subfields like sampling, or this assume this is the shared mesh config tracing sampling 5, and the tracing zipking blah 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 is a standard. Then since standard will take the precedence, eventually the sampling this subfield ideally should be still exist, but currently it's not the case. Eventually this sampling 5 will be gone. So from my perspective, this is kind of a bit anti-intuitive, and the reason is we are using complete override. We are not using like deep merge. So combined with these two issues, there's a situation. Imagine your infrastructure team, they specify a standard mesh config, and they set the value. And you, for example, the dev team try to specify some shared mesh config. Since standard mesh config has a higher priority and together with the complete override, so very likely the shared mesh config specifies the dev team, it will be kind of wiped out completely. I'm not sure this is expected behavior or not. So yeah, just try to get some ideas from the community. I do have some proposals below, but try to hear some opinions first. Yeah, this is my. Oh, sorry. So Mitch, if you scroll up a bit. Yeah. So I have some proposal from my comments 2 weeks ago. So for backward compatibility purpose, I'm thinking to introduce some environment variable, something like to serve as a feature flag. We could try to implement the deep merge logic. But I mean, by default, still the complete override. We could, so customer could kind of opt in the deep merge behavior, or something like this. And I understand John mentioned, yes, the example is not a really good example there. That field has been deprecated. That tracing field has been deprecated. However, today in mesh config, it's not only that tracing field. There are some other field also has a nested structure. So it's more like a generic question. It's not only specific for that field.
So I can see why if we were designing this feature today from the ground up, probably the merge semantics that we're using today would not be what we would choose. I'm less convinced about fixing this moving forward, because merge semantic changes are pretty subtle and can catch users off guard a lot. What I would want to see is that the merge semantic is an overall improvement for all types of use cases.
Yeah. So yeah, because as I mentioned, there's specific use cases. Because, for example, infra team specifies the standard mesh config, and they specify, for example, tracing, and together with a complete override behavior. So anything specified by the dev team, for example, the tracing field will be override completely. Like, I'm not sure this behavior it is expected, or like, at least from my point of view, it's a bit surprised. Like what I specified here will do nothing. So something like this. Yeah. So a bit more. So the reason why we are using complete override, it is I mentioned here, we use this library based on Marshall, or like this is old library. Even the new library, Proto JSON or Marshall, it's kind of doing the same thing. So basically, we're relying on the library, third-party library to define this behavior for us, instead of we like implement our own logic. Yeah. So my proposal is like, yeah, try to add a feature flag to implement the deep merge. Not sure whether that is so yeah, try to implement the deep merge like that. That's not, I mean, still keeps the complete override as a default behavior.
Jerry, I see that you're using tracing as the example use case here, and I can see how for that use case, the merging semantics are not ideal. If you were to use the telemetry API for your trace configuration instead of mesh config, are there other mesh config use cases that you think are still not well served by the current merge semantics, or was tracing the only problem?
So currently, tracing is the biggest one, but so however, if you look at this like global mesh options, that page, there are lots of fields that has the nested structure. So although, yeah, this example is for tracing, but I think this is a more generic question. So what I refer to is this one, this doc. Yeah. So what I'm saying is, for every field, if the field type is not that like this simple type, it has some structure behind, so it could have this kind of problem, right?
Yeah, so as I look through here, we've got a lot of singleton, or not singleton types, what are this called? Simple types.
Yeah, so
Connect, timeout could be
duration, I think, should be good. It's like Proto, but if there are some
scalar, that's the word I'm looking for. Access log encoding is probably a complex type.
Yeah, if there's
Config is definitely a complex type.
yeah proxy config, yeah, default config, it will have some. Yeah, so one more thing, actually, as John mentioned, we have some customized logic. Sit aside with this complete override or deeply merge. So my proposal is not touch that customized logic. My proposal is only touch the that unmarshal file. Yeah, to touch the unmarshal files. So specifically, Mitch, if you go back to the issue, my issue, I have a link at the end, which pointed to a function. Yeah, this one. So this function is the kind of key function how we are doing on Marshall. So if you see line 178, so yeah, like usually like when we do on Marshall, the second parameter, like from my own perspective, it will be an empty structure. Like then we on Marshall this reader, this byte array to an empty structure. In this case, the second parameter is not empty. So we have like PB. Yeah. Then the behavior is like we rely on libraries behavior to define how the library really kind of merge reader to PB. So what my proposal is to add some kind of if condition to change to make it unmarshal to an empty structure first. Then we just kind of like recursively compare each subfield. If the field is from standard mesh config, it will override the shared ones. I mean, keep the current precedence.
Okay.
Hi, Keith.
Hey, sorry, I'm trying to sort of follow here as we get a bit into the details. Can we talk? Can you remind me, please, right quick, what's the use case that you're trying to enable here? What's the goal?
So it's more about like user experience. So for example, the infra team or the they specify the standard mesh config, which has a higher precedence. Then they specify a nested field, a nested mesh config. For example, tracing. Since we have the complete override logic, so when the dev team try to specify, for example, the tracing field in their shared mesh config, that field will eventually be wiped out, do nothing, because standard mesh config first has a higher priority first, together with this complete override logic. Yeah, so eventually what dev team specified in the shared mesh config, the tracing or some other nested structure key, it will be unused.
Yes, I did.
So
Okay, sorry,
yeah.
Go ahead. Thought you were done.
Hopefully this is clear to you, this explanation.
Yeah, so if I had to repeat it back to make sure I understand it correctly, what you're trying to solve for is when the mesh admin, the infra team, is defining something in the shared mesh, in the standard mesh config, but they're defining it in a nested field, meaning that if a user and like an app developer wants to, or somebody else using a shared mesh config, wants to configure an additional field in that same nested structure.
Yeah, right now.
Got it.
Today it will not work at all.
Okay.
It will
Got it. Okay.
confuse them. Like, so my proposal is to have a like opt-in option, which still keeps the precedence. Like standard mesh config has a higher priority than shared mesh config. However, instead of complete override, we do deep merge. Then, if the app developer, they still specify, for example, tracing. They specify some subfield which does not exist in standard mesh config. That subfield will work.
So I think that approach makes sense from a technical perspective. What I'm still not sure about is what are because you talked about tracing as an example, as we talked about earlier, that it's not super motivating just because we already have telemetry API today, right? And I'm looking through the mesh config settings, and I see things like mesh MTLS. I think about, okay, maybe the mesh admin has set the TLS defaults to only accept certain curves.
Yeah.
But maybe an app developer wants to have a different minimum protocol version.
Yeah, something like this.
Yeah, I think about that. I'm like, that's still not quite compelling to me. Sometimes silence from the app developer is silence from the mesh admin who controls the standard mesh config is accepting the Istio defaults. And so, Jue, what would help me to sort of make a decision on this to move forward here is if you could come up with a couple of specific motivating use cases in mesh config for where this breaks. So not something that can be solved with telemetry API, not something where, should the mesh admin really be delegating the minimum TLS version to the entire to the mesh to the app developers or certain mesh config? Like, if you can come up with a couple of specific motivating use cases with links to the mesh config fields, that'll help me evaluate whether or not a deep merge solution for a feature flag is worth the complexity. Like, I think the solution makes sense for sure, don't get me wrong. But I think what I'm struggling with right now is, are there enough people struggling with this problem to where integrating that solution would be worth the complexity? That's where I am, at least. I don't know if others have thoughts.
I see that. That makes sense. Thank you, Keith. Yeah, I think that it's very valid requirement. Yeah, I will go back and take a look. Yeah, I do understand this. Yeah, it's this change may not have many users to adopt. So I will try to look for some more use cases besides the tracing. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, the next item on our agenda is a colleague of mine, Nilek, has a pull request out for adding certificate revocation lists to Istio, particularly for intermediate certificates. I just checked with him. He said he didn't have any particular comments. He just wanted to ask for reviews. So if you've operated in the security area before, or perhaps reviewed a month ago Nilek's document on CRLs, please take a look at that pull request. I'm going to drop it in the chat here for you to have a look at. And then next up is going to be Lior with Gateway Inference.
Hey, yeah. Yeah, I mean, we have talked about it, like lots of folks have provided very good feedback last week, but then I opened this thread, like, just to summarize next steps and on Slack. And some of the feedback there was that, so I'm just gonna remind one thing, like, yeah, last meeting we said, hey, maybe we want to support this on destination rule. And this means that no matter how the request got to the service, then it will get the LoRa aware inference optimization routing. And some of the challenges that were reminded after this is so John's concern was that there's a slight mismatch because right now all the XPROC configs are like only are able to be per route, like literally envoy semantics is per route. There's no like XProc that can actually select an endpoint per an envoy cluster. So this was one concern with the destination rule. And obviously what we could do is we could, like, if it's on destination rule, we could just go ahead and find all the routes that point to this service and then enhance them with this XProc configs. But yeah, John's concern was that there's like a little mismatch there. Yeah, instead, I think I'm trying to get to try to understand what is preferable. Should we instead doing what's here on the document on like option 3, which is just packing some config with extra information, like carrying it over and then constructing it. The other feedback as well was that maybe we only want to support the inference, like the inference API upstream, as opposed to introducing new public API changes for the Istio semantics. So not necessarily make it independently work with only Istio constructs and then translating it to basically what the upstream needs. So yeah, it's just like a little bit of moving away from things we discussed before, but yeah, I just wanted to get this conversation again. And
I think we're probably missing 2 or 3 of the main folks from the discussion last time. So probably not enough to get consensus today. But from my perspective, I think John's point on XProc being route only is a great call out. I didn't connect those dots. So there certainly is a mismatch between destination rule for that use case for like an internal representation. Option 3 of like augmenting the config.config with extra info, such as, what did we say? What was it? Labels? You need the labels or something like that from the resource.
So right now with a lot of things we're doing with labels or annotations, and we're carrying over. But then like we could just have a new type, which is config with extra info, and we kind of provide information a little bit more clean. Right now, the implementation right now, actually, because the internal HTTP route, like Istio internal HTTP route API, has no way for even doing labels or annotations. So right now we're actually manipulating the name of the HTTP route, which which is fine because it's not used for anything other than debugging. But yeah, doing it a little bit more stable would be carrying out this config.
Can someone explain to me why destination rule is no longer the place where we should put policies for load balancing? I mean, whatever arguments John had would apply to all load balancing policies, no?
No, so the thing is, so this currently, so to clarify, it is possible to do it there. It's just John called out one mismatch. So a little background, the current UX for inference is like, people put it in HTTP route, like people deploy inference pool and then referencing from an HTTP route, right? And then the low-level load balancing is, per route. If the request got through this route, it is being optimized. Now, there is this XProc config that is actually able to influence what endpoint is going to be selected is only per route. So there is like XProc per listener and there is XProc per route. There is upstream XProc filter per cluster, but it's not able to actually influence, like the callout happens after the host is selected. This means that if we're doing it on destination rule, what we're going to need to do is basically we're going to need to fetch all the routes pointing to this envoy cluster, and then we're going to need to infuse them, which is the mismatch John called out.
I think we're talking about completely different things. All I'm talking about is the proper place to do load balancing configuration has always been destination rule, and that's the design of Istio. I don't particularly, I mean, I don't know why we need to mix 20 different random things with the UX about load balancing. Inference can do whatever it's doing, HTTP routes can do whatever they are doing. They're completely different things, and XProc or whatever implementation is done for the API, it's also kind of orthogonal. So my point is, if the fundamental change in Istio API is to introduce a way for load balancer to use custom picker. I mean, something that is using
But
whatever.
the current, but when you go into Envoy semantics right now, leave inference, leave everything. Right now, Envoy semantics, if you want to do any load balancing policy that involves XProc, you cannot do it. Like endpoint picking policy that involves XProc, you cannot do it per cluster. It's the Envoy configuration you can do today only is per route. So there is no way for you to program Envoy in a way that traffic reach to this cluster, and only for this cluster, this Envoy cluster, you're going to call out to an XProc, and then you're going to get an endpoint selected. That's not possible with Envoy today.
So you are saying that the configuration that needs to be generated is that all you cannot have different destination use different pickers. They need to be per route.
Right now, yes, what I'm saying right now, the only possible Envoy config you could do to actually influence what endpoint will be selected in the cluster is per route. You don't have XProc per cluster that can influence this. Hey, Keith. Yeah.
Yeah, I think another way of saying it perhaps is that in Envoy, semantically, after the routing, and this sort of makes sense when you say it like this, once the routing stage is complete, the destination has been decided. And so because XProc can change the destination, it seems like it makes sense for that to live in the route versus on the cluster, for the purposes of changing the destination of the traffic.
Yeah. No, it would be nice. I mean, going one abstraction on top of Envoy, it would be nice to have it like, just in general on a service, right? And then like, no matter how the traffic got to the service, just do select me the right endpoint. It's just like, yeah, but like what you're saying makes sense. And what I'm saying, but like it would be nice to have such abstraction that you don't need to care about how the traffic got to there. But like, I think that's John's concern. It's currently a mismatch, and John would probably prefer to not designing these two public APIs towards this experience.
Once again, we have an API that it needs to be. I mean, so we have to mess up our API and to do something ugly and unnatural, because Envoy has limitations that. So basically, we'll be stuck with a bad API forever, even if Envoy is fixing it or whatever.
So costing John's saying the opposite, right? He's saying do not mess with our APIs, just implement the inference API, and internally with no public API, make this implementation work. But do not make, as you call it, ugly API changes to Istio because of it.
Yeah, but I'm personally not very interested in the inference. I'm interested in ability for Istio to have a proper API for doing custom load balancing.
Okay.
That's kind of, it's a more generic and more important problem for Istio to have ability to customize the destination for many other use cases and have a generic API for this, than a very narrow use case that is only used by, maybe 5-10 people. I mean, it's not that everyone every user of Istio is running inferences at this point.
Austin, I think that's a great point. I think that these are two different goals here. One is unblocking Lior and the effort that he's working on, and the other is making sure that there's the concern that you raised, that Istio's custom load balancing API is stable and is and that it fits and that it works and that it makes semantic sense. And the good news on that is that as a project we still have time to exude influence in the Envoy community. We can still exude some influence in the Kubernetes community. The big issue that I see when it comes to semantic model is that Envoy's API for configuration, specifically in the XDS, it doesn't think about, it does a mismatch of Kubernetes generally, because Kubernetes is L4. Like, there's not this concept of a route the same way that there is in Envoy, which is often used for just generic reverse proxy use cases. And so when you say, I want to talk to a service and have custom load balancing for this service, I think that doesn't quite work in the Envoy model, because the translation there is, for this cluster, I want to have custom load balancing. And I think really the Envoy model would say, okay, create a route and then program all the routes that cluster to use with custom load balancing. So I think that's, if I understand correctly, that's where the core mismatch is. And I don't know that I have a great solution for it, but we can talk with the Envoy people to understand more about the thought process behind that design.
Well, in reality, I mean, just kind of words we made up and the complexity we introduced for the sake of. In reality, I mean, every load balancer has an HTTP layer where it's doing routing, and once you route, you know the destination, which is usually a bag of endpoints organized whatever they are organized. The problem seems to be that destination rule is more flexible. Basically, coupled Kubernetes cluster with destination rule, and we have trouble matching with the general concept, which is you routed, you know that you need to go to this bag of endpoints,
Right.
and when you go to that bag of endpoints, you need to pick one particular endpoint out of all of them. The fact you do subsets or you do whatever, it's also part of the same policy. You can basically strip away everything we are doing in Istio, use a custom endpoint picker, and that could implement all the destination rule semantics that we have. So my point is, destination rules doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be with subsets and the old style. We already have kind of adopted the Kubernetes gateway API model of having of not having subsets, so basically having separate service for AB and for versioning. And the problem is that we have an impedance mismatch between wanting to have APIs that express this kind of policies at the subset level versus at the set of endpoint route level, basically.
But
maybe,
go ahead, sorry.
No. So maybe we need to just introduce a mode in destination rules that applies to all subsets, which is not very difficult because it's just we define we can extend the semantics in different ways, and basically have one destination rule per route, which will solve all the problems instead of having separate destination rules.
But luckily, and the direction we're going with ambient and like with the first agenda item for the luckily, we do have HTTP route as a concept, right? And we do rely on this, so we could we could use this to leverage to basically put the attachment there, right? Right now sorry.
Treat the destination rule as a policy attached to the route. Basically. So destination rule doesn't have to be something that floats independently. Yes. It is a vendor extension that we can decide to attach it to a route. So we keep destination rule. But
I'm saying that's fine. That's fine to do. I'm just saying we could argue about UX, whatever, but I'm saying there is an existing UX, which is like there is a route, and from the route, you referencing to an inference pool, as opposed to policy attachment. So you're referencing to an inference pool. So theoretically, you could say what you're saying is like, okay, why there's this UX? I could instead just have a route and then have a destination rule targeting a section name in this HTTP route. This is legitimate. I'm just saying it's moving to policy attachment. I'm saying like within Istio we can decide whether we want to support it or not. It's just that right now there is already if we already move to talk about routes, so we already have something that it's relatively easy. Okay, you have a route just referencing the thing to an inference pool, and it will give you the LoRa world balancing.
Forget about what if I don't have an inference pool? What if I'm not doing inference? I'm doing some random stuff, presentations or something that is
Right.
not having. So that's what we're missing. I mean, I don't want to have something that is only for the LLM. I mean, there are not so many things, not far fewer users of Istio do LLMs than doing other things.
No, that's fair. I'm just saying you're talking more about policy attachment to a route,
Yeah.
which is legitimate. Like we could do policy attachment to a route. Right now, Gateway API has their policy. Like we have a policy attachment model. Istio could have their policy attachment, whatever, right? And just saying, I would not design an API that is like a very, very, very generic policy attachment for anything we ever want to do in enhancing load balancing policy. I would rather tackle it one by one. If you're saying XProc is a policy attachment, this is fine. We could do an XProc policy attachment API.
I'm saying destination rule can be attached to a route. It's perfectly legitimate. It's just how we define it. And then we can keep the load balancing policies attached to the route.
Yeah, I'm gonna come in here and mention that we are all over time, so I'm gonna try to wrap this conversation up and tell everybody thank you for attending. Sounds like we have some more conversation we should be having in the Gateway Inference API Dev Slack channel about the right place for this API. I do think that as we're just discussing this more, Lior and Costin both, it might be time to start evaluating what a generic XProc API would look like, because I think I understand where Costin is coming from in the sense that we shouldn't have a one user experience for LLM inference pool for attaching to the routes, and then for XProc, and then another experience for generic XProc. They should be harmonious, and so it might be time to start thinking about what that looks like generally. So again, really appreciate everybody's time and comments. That is all the time that we have for today. As always, feel free to add agenda items to the agenda doc, and I will see everybody hopefully next time. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.